I've learned over the years that that if I interpose that with what I've sort of started to use most of the time is Robert Naviaux's theory of mitochondrial cell danger response.
Mhm.
He has a fabulous diagram where he says all disease is really one issue at the root cause, which is mitochondrial defense against the toxic load that we are inundated by. And the toxic load that we're inundated by is everything that we can experience from preconception to this present moment in time. So your toxic load then creates mitochondrial dysfunction, mitochondria having many, many functions, but the two most important are producing energy and relaying the photons to electrons in ATP production, but also defending ourselves against the toxic onslaught. And when it becomes too overwhelming and our defenses are too poor, we then go into what he calls this defensive mode, which is evolutionary and protective. And that then it creates this whole metabolic shift, and it tries to pull the individual out of life to preserve their life force so that they can survive the onslaught. So our task as functional medicine doctors, A, is identifying the toxic load, which can be across all layers and levels of the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
You can inherit your grandfather's trauma at Auschwitz,
Mm-hmm.
You can manifest that in your physiology accordingly. So you've got to take a very deep history. And then you've got to look into the biochemistry of the cell danger response. And then you've got to look into what he called, Robert Naviaux called cellulogenesis. Which signaling molecules do you need to put into the system to shift from this defensive mode back out into the health cycle? So when we work in a functional capacity, I use the 7-level model. I'll identify as many of the toxic stresses as we can across the layers and levels of the human experience. I then look at biochemical abnormalities across many dimensions: food, gut, hormones, cell membranes, mitochondria, et cetera, et cetera. What signaling molecules do you need to put back into the system? And then what the patient is responsible for is establishment of their so-called health cycle. How grounded and how reconnected are they to the cycles of day, night, sleep, grounding, good food, macro, micronutrients, good social connections, et cetera, et cetera. They have to be responsible for practicing good health cycle principles. And so between their practices, between identification of toxicology and stresses, and then looking at what signaling molecules need to be used to turn that cell danger inflammatory response around into a healing response, becomes the whole subject of one's clinical interface with patients. Now, the interesting thing about mast cells, when the toxic load becomes excessive, it creates oxidative damage to the cell membranes. That then damages the DNA of mitochondria. And now we have the works of Doug Wallace and et cetera, who say that 95, probably 99% of all diseases have at their root mitochondrial dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
So once the mitochondria are damaged, the DNA is damaged, the DNA of the mitochondria and the ATP become extracellular. And when they're extracellular, they trigger the degranulation of mast cells. And mast cells then release 1,000 mediators of inflammatory mediators across the board, which then further damages the mitochondria. And as you get more and more mitochondrially compromised, you get sicker and sicker as you go along. Some people have estimated you can have up to 70% of your mitochondria not as efficient as they should be, undergoing autophagy and apoptosis, and you can still function quite well. But once you reach a certain threshold and that whole cascade, that inflammatory cascade gets mediated, you then start to get this complexity of multi-system, multi-symptom disease. And that's what we treat and interface with in a clinic such as myself and many other clinics who do similar work. Yeah. I hope
it's a very comprehensive take, and I appreciate that it goes beyond the conventional kind of route of a toxin is a chemical exposure of some sort that goes there, because we know toxins can be so much more. They're hidden. They could be EMF. They could be generational. They could be trauma, emotional, psychological. People have a very limited viewpoint of what a toxin is, if they even consider it. Some people say, what is detox? What is a toxin? We don't care. and just give you drugs to treat your condition, which is a toxin in itself.
And even, and it's a many drugs are mitochondrial toxins.
Right.
Even in functional medicine and integrative medicine, the very common mistake is people go and they say, I have mold illness, or I have Lyme
Yeah.
disease, or I have heavy metal toxicity. And that's this very same mindset as we have in traditional medicine, which is silo-based. It's one thing causing one problem, causing one symptom. It's never like that. We
Yeah.
always find 20 determinants of why the mitochondria are misbehaving. Well, they're not misbehaving, they're evolutionary defensive. They're actually doing exactly what they're meant to do. But why is the person so symptomatic? It's multiple stresses, multiple triggers, multiple toxins across a lifetime
Yes.
that contributes. And so the task of an integrative physician is to try and identify instead of the 5-minute appointment, the 2-3 hour appointment, plus the lab work, as many of those determinants as you can. And that becomes the subject of an integrative interface between the patient and yourself. Yeah.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, a lot of medicine and a lot of patients are looking for the magic pill for the one thing that's wrong with them, right? It's one diagnosis and then it's one solution. And I agree, this happens sometimes in the integrative or functional or alternative world where it's, oh, you have this diagnosis, you
Yeah,
need hyperbaric to,
that's
oxygen
right.
chamber, and that's it. And we're just going to put you in there over and
Yeah,
over and over until you
yeah,
get better. And you
yeah,
usually don't. You might see improvement just like you might see improvement taking a drug at first,
yeah.
but you never got to all the root causes because it was never a singular one, correct?
Never, never singular.